Why, hello everyone. Happy 4th of July. It is GleeCon, and I am here celebrating this holiday with you by doing another episode of Lore of Warcraft. Today we're going to be reading one of the non-canon stories from the Folk and Fairytales, or something like that, of Warcraft. So, on the last episode, we wrapped up Maraudon on our classic walkthrough playthrough. We did an Alliance completionist run. In the last episode, we took all of the time tying up the loose ends, turning in all of the quests. So check that episode out if you want to see the results of my first on-camera long-form run of Maraudon. And if you like whatever you see today, of course, leave me a comment, like, subscribe, get that algorithm working in our favor so that we can keep on seeing progress and growth from all of the time spent doing this amazing project. If you also really dig it, you can check out my Patreon to see a couple of the free episodes I have on there. Subscribe to that to see when new things drop. And if you want to support me, you can get access to the same treatment. I do all of the same things that I do for Warcraft, but I do it for the Assassin's Creed universe. All right, so stay a while and listen as we read this little short story fable called Why the Mermaids Left Boralus by Tamsin Muir, illustrated by Corey Godby. And I think we're still about a quarter of a millennia. I don't know, or what's 10,000 years called? We're about 25-ish hundred, give or take, years before the Dark Portal opens. And this is the picture. I think we've done this is about our 8th story. So there's 12 total. Each one of these represents one of the stories that we've read. So about 2/3 of the way through the book. In the oldest days of Boralus, the spit at the mouth of the river led out into very deep sea with nothing to protect it. And even the narrows were many fathoms deep, indeed so deep at their center that a lead plummet would fall forever. No length of rope long enough to sound the strait. This was back when Boralus was so new that almost nobody even thought of themselves as Kul Tiras, and when the old folk talked of home, it was understood they were still thinking of the peninsula. Rocky Boralus was just that, a rock, with little to protect its houses from the wind and waves. Its citizens counted themselves fishers and shipwrights and sailors and pearl divers, people who spent more hours on water than between walls, and none of them lived easy lives. Yes, the broad escarpments of Tiragard sheltered it from the south, and the gales from the frozen sea were softened by the time they rolled over the green range to its north. To its west, even the most fragile skiff could find protected anchorage in the bight, the inward delta where all 3 islands huddled like men with their backs to the wind. The cruelty was in the east, where the great sea ruled unchallenged all the way to Barrett Bay. In its best moods, the great sea was tender and even, the blue of steel, only softer. In its worst, it lashed out against Boralus like a drunkard wanting a fight, violent, capricious, and colored so deeply blue as to look like a bruise. No murmur of the Tide Mother could reach anyone's ears when the great sea was in a frenzy. The rocks upon which Boralus was built could withstand this treatment, but the houses could not. Each passing storm sent huts, ships, and racks down to the bottom of the harbor together and dashed men, women, and children to death on the rocks, or pulled them down to accompany the ships. Each passing year produced at least one storm that threatened to wipe the rocks clean of Boralus for good, and in the morning they said the drowned bodies bobbed so thick in the harbor that the living would just cover them with weighted nets and sink them down to the seafloor. Of course, a seawall would have saved them when the Tide Mother could not, but the dark blue waters between the spit were so deep that tossing in 1,000 rocks each day for 1,000 years would have done nothing, and the work of repairing the mounding wall after a storm would claim as many lives as it saved. The people of Boralus reckoned that if they were to live, it would have to be by their wits and bravery alone. This is how it is and was for Kul Tiras. The light rewards conviction, but the ocean demands activity. So the sailors who lived in hard Boralus back then were so stout of heart and so quick of mind that they would be right to laugh nowadays at our bragging navies and marines. On a fair day, it was wonderful to see the long ships go into the harbor with their bright flags flying and the pilots rowing to guide them out and in. And it was a terrible sight during a storm when on land all the people could do was watch the unfortunate boats breaking up before they ever made it past the spit, all the while shoring up their own walls as the waters rose, only hoping that the men and women on the water drowned quickly. For on the sea and on the shore, when a storm hit Boralus, nobody was safe but the mermaids. Mermaids lived openly near Boralus then. They made their homes in deep caves along the coastline, deeper still than any cable had ever reached, beyond any mortal woman or man's ability to dive. Some pearl divers said they'd seen their houses and claimed they looked like palaces or temples, piled high with treasure from scuttled ships. The people of Boralus, like most people who were fearless and hardened to disaster, had no guile and loved to believe in these tales. They'd all seen the mermaids and knew they were as real as sirens or murlocs. They had human-like arms and heads and bodies, except that their hands had webs between the fingers, like a seabird's feet, and their bodies, not having legs, ended in a fish's tail. They had beautiful faces and long curly hair, and that skin and that hair were tinted all the shades found in seaweed and coral. Mermaids were not too shy to sit on the rocks and watch the ships, which was how most of Boralus had seen them, and it was reliable knowledge that the worst storms were always presaged by the sight of mermaids clinging to the rocks, and the worst winters came when they were seen on the crackling plates of sea ice outside the harbor, plaiting their long hair. Fishing went badly if the fishers glimpsed a mermaid in the water, and soon sailors began to say that just seeing one in the harbor meant the weather would turn. This made it simple to believe that mermaids brought the storms rather than simply portending them, and that a mermaid sighted on the first day of a voyage doomed the entire journey to failure. The sailors swore blind that they had seen mermaids lifting rocks from the seafloor to scuttle ships where there had been no rocks before, or becalming the waters or making them choppy, whichever one the sailors hadn't wanted at the time. And then the whole of Boralus talked of luckless women bringing home the day's catch dragged down into the deep by things that looked like girls, or of men in pilot boats coming alone and friendless back to the harbor, overturned in the dark by green-haired mermaids who laughed to watch them drown. Our in-book quote is, each mermaid had been allotted a certain amount of the mother's power from birth, and the moment that power got used up, the mermaid would pop like a bubble and die. The sea priests were meant to warn against these superstitions, and they did, but only to a point. Back then, the monastery across from the harbor was nothing more than huts and a cloister for the tide sages to live in. Without the tide sages, of course, very few ships would have made the crossing at all. Each ship from Boralus wanted to go in and out of the harbor, carried a sea priest if the sailors wanted their journey to end anywhere above the water. Many sea priests followed their vessels straight down to the salt arms of the Tide Mother in extremity, as they were the first to board and the last to disembark. And Boralus's harbor was the grave for many pious men and women who, determined to save as many as possible, kept the waters from dragging sailors down with their perishing vessel. In those days, those who walked the stormy path often walked it beginning to end when they were still young, and for all that the sea priests were dearly beloved, fathers still wept when their children heard the whispers, were sent to the sages in the valley. Perhaps it was because they rarely made it to a wise old age that sea priests did not warn the people off superstition as they should have done, and often did not chide a sailor for tossing rocks off the bow at the flash of a mermaid's tail. Certainly none of them could have imagined that, far from laughing, at least one mermaid wept when she watched them drown. Halia was this mermaid, full-grown from the egg, who lived in a deep-sea cave decorated not with the spoils of sunken ships, but with the prettiest shark bones picked clean by crabs. Mermaids did live in the dim, forgotten buildings and temples of those long since gone from Kul Tiras, or those thankfully prevented from returning, but they favored wreaths and hangings of brightly colored kelp, and their only wealth was pearls, which they considered little better than pebbles. Mermaids had no idea of the ire they had gained from sailors, and were hurt by their attacks if they knew of them at all. They clung to the long rocks before a storm in order to hunt huge boils of fish coming into the harbor for safety, and they knew to sit on sea ice only when it was frozen solid and could bear their weight. It was true that mermaids had great power over the rocks and the water, But they did not like to use it lightly. Each mermaid had been allotted a certain amount of the mother's power from birth, and the moment that power got used up, the mermaid went pop like a bubble and died. Therefore, mermaids, being naturally selfish, did not make mages of themselves. A thrifty mermaid might live 500 years, but once she passed, there would be no trace of her. Unfortunately, it was also true that mermaids often halved a fisherman's catch, since they shared the same ground for catching in and were ignorant or contemptuous of the fishers, and it was true that mermaids from foolishness had sent some to their deaths, but rarely from malice. Mermaids were not sirens, and did not seek to enthrall humans. They considered sirens lazy, and murlocs deplorable. Halia was regarded as flighty and rather stupid by her sisters, who numbered in the dozens, and very pretty, but not enough to remedy her flaws. She was their youngest sister, and this is often the lot of the baby. She had beautiful scales like coral, and her curls were the deep green, dead green of algae, the kind that's nearly blue from growing so far away from the light. Her besetting sin was a love of watching the ships go by. She thrilled to see their flags fluttering in the eastern wind. She could watch these for hours, and had done so from when Boralus was first built. And though young, she knew enough and heard enough to be deeply grieved by the sailors' ill regard. Her sisters said she was a fool and a child to keep playing in the wakes of those ships, knowing the sailors hated her, to which she said, "Ah, but I must watch over them that live on Boralus, for their lives are so hard and their legs so ungainly. Who knows when I could help them?" When the sailors swore at her and cast their lanterns into the water after her, and her sisters argued with her twice as much, she said, "I must be even more watchful, and help them if I can, for now I know they don't like me, and it will be better in the end if I can help them, and will mean more." Then her sisters cursed her for a martyr as well as a fool. This did not stop her following the ships, and in her foolish love of bright things and beauty, she made her favorite the two-master Windward, which had some of the brightest flags of all, with the most daredevil of sailor boys and girls for a crew, and its sea priest was the tide sage Erie. And Halia adored Erie. And the next in-book quote, "Kill fish out of hunger and kill pirates to defend yourselves," she said, "but I won't suffer you to kill a mermaid out of chicken-heartedness." Erie was loved very deeply by the people of Boralus, and not simply because she had vouchsafed Windward and its cargo over many journeys from the peninsular kingdoms and much farther beyond. They loved her because they loved bravery and quickness, and Erie was as quick and brave as any Boralus could boast of. The sun had burned her brown, and the duty made her mouth unsmiling, and she was pensive and thoughtful in her ways. She thought unflaggingly of duty, which made the Windward's captain and boatswain fond of her, but she was no haughty scholar or conceited of her status. She had been born on Boralus in a gutter's hut. How lovely Halia thought her in her vestments, hoodless, with her strange brown hair the color of the mainmast itself. Halia loved to watch it flutter in the sea breeze, so lustrous and unlikely in hue, and she naively let herself follow quite close in the boat's wake, the better to look at Erie's lovely hair and mourn her poor ponderous legs. Here we have a nice picture of a Boralus ship. The sailors were beside themselves each time they saw her head break the water, and begged the captain to let them scare her off or even kill her. But Erie would have none of it. "Kill fish out of hunger and kill pirates to defend yourselves," she said, "but I won't suffer you to kill a mermaid out of chicken-heartedness." And because Erie was as much respected as she was admired, the sailors were ashamed and forced to let Halia be. How Halia loved to swim alongside the Windward as it left the harbor on sunny days with the gulls crying. She watched anxiously when it was due back to Boralus, and she was so delighted as it returned that she left her hair half combed. And just as Erie asked for the Tide Mother's blessings, or thanked her for those given, she never failed to give that mermaid a salute when the Windward arrived, or bid her a solemn goodbye when the Windward left. If new men and women on board tried to jeer at their tide sage for making a mascot out of an accursed mermaid, they soon learned not to, for as well as being popular with the crew, Erie had hard fists. In the old days of Boralus, the tide sages were not above a sharp blow to the irreverent, and Erie was not too devout to issue them. When the Windward was anchored in the deep blue Boralus harbor, giddy and grateful Halia would ply Erie with her choicest gifts. When Erie tied up her long brown hair and plunged into the harbor for her morning swim, She would come back to her clothes to find dainty parcels of kelp-wrapped fish or eels, so fresh as to not even be all the way dead, or fresh clams wrapped up the same way, kept damp and alive by means of clever knots in the seaweed to make it watertight. When the fishing was poor, Halia could offer only pearls, and so Eerie found handfuls of tiny seed pearls in such a rainbow of colors as humans have never seen, or enormous white pearls that could have graced the crowns of queens in Lordaeron. Because Eerie was as sensible as she was serious, she dumped this impossible wealth back into the water weeds, and Halia grew to assume that humans thought as little of pearls as mermaids did. This is why there's so much bubble seaweed in Boralus Harbor. It is all of Halia's discarded pearls. Halia was still too shy to ever address herself to the human woman, but in observing her, Halia grew more familiar with her ways than she had when the Tide Sage was only a wonderful figure on the dock of the Windward. More familiar, though she did not know this, than was anyone else with Eerie's ways and moods, for Eerie did not seek company in anything other than prayer, and though widely respected, she was held in awe more than she was sought for festivity. Halia had unthinkingly disrupted her loneliness. Halia thought nothing of this, but only how much she liked to watch Eerie's strong-armed stroke cutting through the water, and to admire how she swam like a dolphin despite the piteous drawback of those long brown legs, and to long to see her smile. Halia in her 100 years' youth laughed easily, but how old sometimes did Eerie seem. And indeed at first Eerie was solemn over the mermaid's offerings, and then she was touched by them, and then over a long while she was amused by them in her own way, being slow to humor. She spent a whole voyage wondering how to return a gift to the fair mermaid, for Eerie, though a human, was not too austere to admire Halia's lovely face and form, nor her profusion of kelp-green curls, nor even her coral-colored tail, and she thought she would seem a churl not to give a gift in return. She spent that voyage sharpening Halia a cunning little gut-hook knife, as Boralus women suffered from an excess of practicality, and on returning to the harbor walked into the shallows and called for the mermaid. The next in-text quote, "Don't you know that if you waited until dawn and slit your poor feet from the toes to the heels until the water turned red with your blood, then walked in the harbor, that the mother would take pity on you?" This was their first real meeting, with the Tide Sage standing waist-deep in the clear green waters of the harbor, and with the mermaid approaching, too shy to look Eerie directly in the eyes. She was forced to take Eerie's hand when the Tide Sage pressed the knife into it, and if Halia's lips could not be eloquent, her eyes were. In that moment, they both found each other enchanting. Halia was thrilled and knew only joy. Eerie was grave and deeply moved. When they had kissed and confirmed the other felt likewise, and called each other by name and said tender things to each other, Halia said to Eerie, "Say you'll stay with me and live with me for always in the harbor." "Even a Tide Sage cannot live underwater," said Eerie. Halia laughed at her beloved ignorance and said, "Don't you know that if you waited until dawn and slit your poor feet from the toes to the heels until the water turned red with your blood, then walked into the harbor, that the mother would take pity on you? She would make your legs fall off and make a tail grow there instead, so that you could become a mermaid and live with me. Take the pretty knife you just gave me and do it." Eerie shook her head. "In another life I would, but not this one. I've walked the path and pledged what I am to the Tide Mother, and ships cannot move through fearful fuel without me. There are not enough Tide Sages that I could throw off my duty and live with you, Halia." "Then live with me anyhow, and I will forgive you the legs," said Halia, who was growing increasingly desperate. "Let me swim beside your ship when you leave harbor and make yourself a house by the shore. And if you cannot keep house for me, then I will keep yours. And if anyone else asks you to be their sweetheart, you can say no and point at me." Eerie grew more serious than ever, for she did not bandy around much with dissembling or untruth, but she said, "I must never tell anyone of my love for you, Halia, or they'll never take me willingly on the Windward again, and it will be the death of them." At this Halia cried, as mermaids cry very easily. Eerie did not as Tide Sage grudge tears just as much, but Halia loved Boralus and loved the Windward, and thinking of all the pretty ships in the jaunty Windward as so much old wood at the bottom of the sea, she was hard pressed, so she agreed that their love must be secret. From that time on, mermaid and sea priest met in quiet coves and waterways, and as they kept their truth, they became more dear to the other. But Eerie's resolve, though it wavered, held fast, and although Halia sometimes thought her heart would break, She steeled herself and did not stoop to beg Eerie to cut those feet and join her down in the deep waters of the harbor. And whenever Eerie joined the windward and set sail, Halia did not join her, but pined for her until her sisters were quite alarmed. The windward was in dock when the great storm came to Boralus. Boralus was usually in good readiness for storms, being wise to their signs, but this one crept upon them like a murderer. It lashed at them of an evening, and did not abate in the morning. Other ships limped into the little port, and the waters rose. The people in the town spent all day in the wind and the rain, shoring up the groaning flood walls. By the third and fourth days the storm was even worse, and the Kul Tiras were collapsing to drown in the standing water, and the ships were dashing themselves to pieces on the rocks with their crews trapped inside them. Eerie and the bedraggled handful of other tide sages were present. There was no way to fill their numbers from the little monastery, and no entry from the swollen south. Back then a journey on foot into the Sound would have been equally as dangerous as sailing in, and during a storm most of the paths would have been under water. Knowing there was no hope of reinforcements, Eerie set herself and the others at the river's mouth in nothing more than little skiffs and dinghies to try to divert the rising water. There being no seawall, they were forced to do its work themselves, to cut the waves and shatter their power before they reached much farther into the harbor, and to redirect the tempestuous sea itself back into the pitiless ocean. Behind them the people of Boralus were sucked down into the waves, and the ships were tossed as though they were fishermen's coracles. But Eerie and the others could do nothing but hear the shouts and screams, knowing that a moment's faltering would see the town swept clean like a flagstone. In all this the mermaid Halia had not been idle. She minded her lover's advice and did not stay close to her, but tried to help men and women who had fallen in and could still be saved. She longed to use some of her magic to shore up the crumbling edges of the town, but was too afraid. She was also afraid of someone spotting her and of getting blamed for such a hideous storm, and she was equally afraid of straying too far away from Eerie. On the 5th day of the storm, many of the other tide sages had faltered, exhausted or broken, but Eerie grimly hung on like a limpet until she was alone. When she was left by herself and night fell, Halia swam to her and begged her to slit open her feet and save herself from the storm, or at least to rest, but Eerie would have none of either. "There's a chance yet," she said. "The storm will be at its peak tonight, but it is breaking half the split into the water. Behold that wave coming toward us. If it gets through me, all is lost. If I can seal the harbor's mouth now, I will. If I die, I would as lief leave Boralus behind me." "If you die, I die," said Halia. "I will help you." For Halia knew, looking on Eerie, that to save Eerie's life, she would easily incur the Tide Mother's wrath, and it did not seem as though the Tide Mother could show her fury more plainly than she was showing it now. So when Eerie stood in the rocking skiff and with one mighty blow parted the boiling gray waters, Halia held the water back from the other side, so between them they ripped the seas in twain as though they had each grasped the edge of a piece of linen. At the harbor mouth, a wall of water churned and clawed, stupefying those fatigued townsfolk still fighting the storm in Boralus. But between the mermaid and the sea priest, the ocean found no purchase. Halia was delighted, but Eerie stood in the skiff and called, "Beloved, it is not yet done." Halia said courageously, "If you hold the water, I will raise a wall." Then Halia the mermaid was the one who churned the mud and stone up from the seabed and attacked the crumbling chunks of what cliff face had fallen into the water, trying to mingle sandstone and chalk with hardest basalt. It was a brave intention, and a crest of the Tide Mother's magic swept through the harbor like lightning. Halia did not know it then, but it made each and every one of her sisters, huddled in their homes and drowsing to the far-off sounds of the storm, jolt awake. A brave intention, but so difficult in execution. Even as Halia built the rocks, they would not stay together, or were battered apart by the thundering waves into drifts of shrapnel that cut her skin and scales to pieces. In a welter of terror, she poured more and more of herself into the work, the very life that coursed within her, without heed for her own existence. She thought only of Eerie standing above in a little boat, with that little boat now mostly in pieces, kept together only by the pressure of tide sage magic. She thought of brave little Boralus, too, clinging to the rock, and the ships going down in the harbor. She poured so much of her life into the wall that she had to stop, frightened of how tired she was, pausing only ever so often to break upward through the waves and check on her lover and see if they could stop. But Eerie would only say, "It is not yet done." Neither Halia nor Eerie gave way or faltered very much in the wake of a losing battle. Halia's horrified sisters were the first to break through the storm of rubble that Halia was creating and shouted her to stop, or to rest at least. When she did neither, they did not know what to do. It was not that they were frightened of the storm, or sorry for Boralus, but they had never conceived of one of their own paying any kind of price for it. To see their foolish little sister half dead from her selfless rigors made them angry and guilty. When they saw the wall gnashing upward from the seabed, they threw themselves into her labor and withheld nothing, for mermaids are passionate and do nothing by halves. Halia's wall surged and seethed with shell and rock and mud and the crumbled wood and steel from ships that had already sunk to the bottom of the harbor, and the bones of the dead sailors themselves. More and more mermaids emerged from their bolt holes and temples, and threw themselves into the wall without misgiving, and soon they were building upward, 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 until the wall had nearly broken the crest of the waves. In text quote is that she slipped into the cold, turbid waters like a corpse, straight down to the bottom of the harbor. Eerie, knowing nothing of this yet, fought alone. She was standing in the wreck of her ship, endlessly pulling back on the waves as though she were tugging a rope. Here her human fellows joined her at last. Beating bravely through the current came the windward, which had risked... Oh, here's the picture, but it's kind of... we can do a little rotation. And then spread it to make it look a little better. This is kind of more, I think, what it's supposed to look like. This is, or maybe it's the other way around. Actually, that's probably... There we go. So this is a picture of, I don't know which one. See the sky, but it's the picture of, I turned my cell phone on silent. I don't know why I did that. I guess I didn't. But a picture of our two lovers, the Kul Tiras and the mermaid. Only the storm... Oh, I was halfway through the page. Her human fellows, which had risked not only the storm... I don't know why this one came in so small. Weird. But the fresh danger of the mermaids darting visibly to and fro amid huge boils of water, stone, and mud. The sailors were scared almost more of the mermaids than they were of the rock fragments that were embedding themselves in the windward's hull. To them it seemed like the end of the world. Erie's skiff was destroyed by then, and to the sailors of the windward she appeared to be standing on the water as though it were solid stone. They'd gathered up the half-drowned sailors and now sought to rescue their tide sage, shouting at her to board and save herself. No matter what they said, she would not come to them. They stood shivering in awe to watch her and to watch a great and terrible wall being built beneath her feet until she was standing on solid stone and rising with it. They also stood shivering in fear to watch the mermaid surface, then dive all around her and this wall, and to see one in particular return over and over by her side, though she was weak and beaten bloody by tearing wind, water, and rock. Watch was all the windward crew could do. Watch and keep calling for Eerie. The great seawall towered higher and higher until it was as high as the windward's prow, then high again as its mast, and Eerie standing fearlessly atop it. And as the wall grew, some of the oldest mermaids, totally spent, fell lifeless as they worked. They rose to the surface of the water, became a sizzle of bubbles, and were gone. The other mermaids did not falter. The sailors were sicker with sorrow now, and their cries for Eerie were now often cries for the mermaids to take pity on themselves and stop. Stop they did, but only when the wall was so tall that it cast a great shadow down upon the windward, and when Eerie was a figure high above the crow's nest in the topsail, and when the only figure moving in the surface of the water was a single mermaid, one who kept calling to Eerie over and over as they did, asking her if the work was yet done. When Eerie finally turned around as though to answer, she fell, as spent as the dead mermaids, bubbling on the foam. But when they died, they popped. She fell down the whole length of that wall to a terrible cry from the windward. She slipped into the cold, turbid waters like a corpse, straight down to the bottom of the harbor. The sailors on the Windward watched as the last lone mermaid dived down after her, and they watched as the waves hammered into the wall without Erie to hold them back, and they watched that wall hold steady against them. They could cheer at that at least, but their cheers died as they watched the mermaid struggle back to the surface with their tide sage, who was not moving or breathing either. The Windward sailors put out their dinghy and hauled the mermaid, yes, the mermaid, and Erie back to the deck of the Windward, with frantic working at the davit in the falls. There the other tide sages worked on her, and the sailors too, and cleared great gouts of seawater from Erie's lungs, but she would not breathe for them. Almost nobody protested when the mermaid, sprawling on the deck, drew a little pearl-handled knife. Those who did protest were held back by their fellows. She struggled with Erie's shoes and hacked at them, and then she slit open the soles of Erie's very feet. Then she dragged the motionless woman with her, struggling along on the deck, and with her great bright tail covered in blood and scales and mud, and it was frightful. The mermaid kept crying, "The harbor! The harbor!" and the sailors, with the great bravery of pity, pushed both women over the railing. Erie and the mermaid tumbled down into the dark water and disappeared. Only then did the hard-bitten sailors of the Windward weep for the love of the tide sage, who had been their devoted friend and helper. They wept too for the dead mermaids and sailors alike, who had given them and Boralus their lives. They waited but saw nothing, and they cried bitterly. The captain had just given the order to trim the sails and prepare to turn about when they saw a dark head break the water. The hair now had a strange sheen, but the eyes were open, and the face was Erie's. In place of strong legs, a tail shimmered beneath the surface of the sea. The sailors' pity had been great, but greater still was the mother's. Halia's arms were around Erie's neck, and she wept and laughed alternately for joy. All of Kul Tiras now knows Erie's story, even if she never returned to them again as a priest of the sea and a fellow in arms. As long as the mighty seawall of Boralus has stood, its people now swear on mermaids as symbols of highest honor and good luck, and as symbols of sacrifice too, for no mermaids were ever seen again within that harbor. On certain calm sunsets, when the red is deeply reflected on the surface of the harbor, old sailors call it Erie's blood, which presages good weather in remembrance of the dutiful tide sage and the mermaid who loved her so faithfully. There's a lot of things that this story made me think about. It makes me think somewhat of the necessity of the redredging. Some of these things we take for granted now. You think if any of you are familiar with the kind of waterways around New York City, Manhattan, or around Niagara Falls, there are areas where Herculean efforts were put to rechannel and redirect rivers and harbors so that ships could navigate them. I also think about there's a kind of an element of this fable that I don't like, which is the two main characters. It kind of contributes to main character syndrome, which I think is humans as a species or storytelling. We can't help it. It's part of our nature. And we are defined by the stories that we tell and that we read, or, nowadays that we watch, that we consume. And most of these stories have a main character, and it perpetuates this idea that we're all the main character of our own story. We're all the heroes of our own story when we go to bed at night. And for the most part, certainly in Western civilization, and not to say that that's right or wrong, but there are a lot of bad negativity that comes from it. And in this particular case, the main characters get a happy ending, but every single mermaid dies. Their motivation is very minimal for it, and all they get are for the other NPCs to put mermaids on their boats or get mermaid tattoos or whatever. That's a crap trade-off. So that element of this fable, because this book is fables, and I think there's a conscious effort as I read it to tap into different fable structures. So, you have other ones that tap into more oral tradition, indigenous type structures. This is right here. This story is different than the others. If you've watched the other episodes in this series, the others they might be more childlike or more narrative. This one is heavily long form written, which there's a lot of old sea. You think about Moby Dick, you think about other, like, the Old Man in the Sea. There's a lot of big, and this is obviously nothing like those in terms of like what the content or quality is, but these long, dense, prose heavy passages. This is more like that than any other story. Um, I think that goes with the style, and it also helps with this sea motif. Anyway, these are just random thoughts that popped into my head. Overall, I liked it. I like writing like that. It's more when I try to dabble. That's more what I lean towards myself. But yeah, so this was an interesting one, a nice fable, and obviously it is a fable because maybe there's a real story behind the seawall in Boralus, but this is also why this is tabbed at about 2,500 years, because they're saying this is before Kul Tiras was a nation. So we're talking about before we had talked about Stromgarde. So Stromgarde was on the rise, and you can kind of trace lineage. This is when I say before, like in the past one or two episodes of our lore. So this talks about the kind of rise of these human nations, and Kul Tiras, there is a timeline, especially according to Chronicles, about when it kind of was established, and we're putting ourselves before that. But you would imagine with the building of the seawall, the nation would begin to thrive. So not a crazy amount of time before that, maybe 100 years or so. All right. Thank you, everybody, so much. I hope you enjoyed the story. I hope you have a fun and safe 4th of July. I'll be joining you guys again tomorrow for us to do a long Maraudon run with on the Horde side. And when we finish that run and turning it in, so over these next couple days, we will officially be 3/4 of the way through our Classic Era walkthrough. So join me on that one. Again, smash that like, leave the comments. Thank you for joining me this episode in the Pipe 5x5.